The sky above Pontus was not blue, not really. It was a steely wash of cold gray, like the gleam of a blade waiting to taste blood. In the shadowed corridors of history, some men rise with banners and others with secrets. Mithridates VI of Pontus was the latter, more shadow than king, more myth than man. You can almost hear it, can't you? The hollow silence before the storm, the hush that lingers behind stone walls, where whispers grow louder than shouts. This is where our story begins. Imagine him standing at the edge of the Black Sea, the wind cutting against his skin like 1,000 whispers of betrayal. His gaze fixed not on the churning waters, but on something deeper, an ancient, gnawing paranoia that had grown inside him like a cancer. Mithridates Eupator, they called him, a boy orphaned by blood, raised in exile, crowned in vengeance. He knew from the start that a crown was not made of gold. It was wrought in poison, in daggers, in whispered lies between lovers. His own mother had tried to kill him. His own brother did not live long enough to try. There was no trust in his world, only anticipation of the blade. And so, from his youth, Mithridates did something most would call madness. He swallowed death by the grain, by the leaf, by the drop. A tincture of hemlock, a dusting of arsenic, nightshade on the tongue like bitter honey. What doesn't kill you, he believed, could be trained to kneel before you. He wasn't wrong. Each dose was a ritual. Alone in the dark, he would drink from cups others feared to touch, his hand steady, his heart stone. He watched for tremors, for sweat, for the choke of death rising in the throat. Nothing came, not even a cough. His body, once mortal, began to change. He was becoming something else. They say he grew immune to nearly all known poisons, that his blood could turn a dagger's edge dull, that his very breath was laced with suspicion. He was no longer merely a king, he was a weapon, self-forged, self-feared, but immunity comes at a price, doesn't it? Every sip of venom made the world around him more dangerous. Because what could hurt a man who had trained his body against death itself? Only betrayal, only those he let closest, and so he trusted no one. Not the women who warmed his bed, not the generals who raised his banners, not the courtiers who smiled as they passed the wine. He ruled with a gaze sharp as obsidian and a voice that could freeze the Black Sea. He demanded loyalty not through love, but through fear, because love could be poisoned. By the time he was 30, Mithridates commanded an empire stretched across the northern crescent of the Mediterranean. He challenged the might of Rome not once, but 3 times. The Republic, that iron machine, bled at his hands. Senators cursed his name in marble halls, while soldiers whispered it in fear from the shadows of Anatolia. But for all his power, he was a man forever haunted. Haunted by the shadow of his mother's treachery. Haunted by the taste of poison on his tongue. Haunted by the knowledge that immortality, no matter how carefully cultivated, was still just a longer walk toward the grave. And the world around him was watching, because while Mithridates was hardening himself into legend, Rome was becoming something else, an empire that swallowed legends whole. They sent their best against him, Sulla, Lucullus, Pompey, each man a beast in his own right. But Mithridates did not yield. He slipped through their fingers like oil, vanished into mountains, returned with armies. He was a ghost, wrapped in purple robes. And through it all, the poison never stopped. Even as war raged, as cities burned, as the earth itself seemed to conspire against him, he continued his regimen. Some nights he would lie awake, sweating in the dark, not from fear, but from the toxic fire that coursed through his veins. He knew the names of every plant that killed, every mineral that silenced. He spoke languages most could not even read: Latin, Persian, Greek, Galatian. He was not just a king, he was a scholar of death. But who was he truly? A hero? A monster? A child who never stopped running from the knife at his throat? You see, the story of Mithridates is not about war. Not really. It's about a man who looked at mortality and said no. A man who chose to drown in poison rather than trust a single soul. A man who built an empire just to shield himself from the inevitability of betrayal. But empires, like bodies, rot from within. His own sons would rebel. His wives would turn. The men he fed and clothed would spit in his face. He had trained his body to survive anything, but not his heart. That perhaps was the one thing he could not immunize. Still, even in decline, he would not be forgotten. When at last his kingdom began to crumble and his allies betrayed him, Mithridates did what he had always trained for. He turned to the poison. He drank. He waited. And for the first time, nothing happened. The very immunity that had been his fortress now became his prison. He could not die the way he had planned. Death, too, had betrayed him. So he begged his closest guard to do what a lifetime of venom could not. Drive the blade home. End the man who could not be killed. And in the end, it was not poison that claimed Mithridates VI of Pontus. It was trust. The very thing he had feared all along. Now tell me, can you still taste it? That bitterness on your tongue? The story has only begun. There are secrets still buried in the soil of Pontus, in the broken crowns and rusted daggers of history. But the wind remembers. The silence remembers. And tonight, so do you. You came here for a story, but what you've entered is a grave. Shall we keep digging? The world had changed since the boy with poison on his breath first took the throne. But Mithridates, he hadn't. Not really. He just grew sharper, colder, more patient, like a blade honed for a single kill, over and over, across decades. In the soft gloom of his court, where torchlight clung to black marble like fading memories, they whispered of him as if he were not flesh, but fate. Servants bowed low, not out of duty, but out of fear that even the air might be laced with venom. He walked among them like a god, his silence louder than any decree. But behind that silence, there was always the whisper of Rome. It was always Rome, the juggernaut that consumed everything in its path. Peoples, gods, kings. Its legions marched like clockwork, its generals bloated with triumph, its greed endless. Mithridates had watched it from afar at first, then at arm's length, and then beneath his boots. In 88 BCE, he made his move. Asia Minor was a nest of Roman corruption, governors bleeding cities dry, taxes turning to shackles, and temples defiled in the name of civilization. The people, furious and broken, looked to the east, and they saw not a savior, but a storm. Mithridates descended like thunder. He orchestrated a massacre so calculated, so chilling, that it stained the soil red from Ephesus to Pergamon. Over 80,000 Roman and Italian settlers slaughtered in a single coordinated purge. Not soldiers, not combatants, but civilians, merchants, families, women, even children. They called it the Asiatic Vespers. One night, one breath, one exorcism of empire. The message was clear. Mithridates did not want to negotiate. He wanted to cleanse, to burn the infection of Rome from the veins of the East. And for a time, he succeeded. Cities flocked to him, not just out of fear, but hunger. For revenge, for justice, for something beyond the cold dominion of Rome. His armies swelled, gold poured into his coffers. His navy darkened the Aegean like a thundercloud. He wasn't just a king now. He was a symbol. To Rome, a madman. To others, a liberator. And to himself, a man playing chess with gods. But symbols are dangerous things. They inspire, yes, but they also attract fire. The Senate stirred. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a name spoken like a sword unsheathed, was sent to crush him. And Sulla did not believe in restraint. He was cruel, efficient, and utterly merciless. Where Mithridates dealt in poison and performance, Sulla dealt in steel and spectacle. Their war was more than just a campaign. It was a clash of philosophies, East against West, cunning against brute force, legacy against ambition. For years they danced their death waltz through blood-soaked fields and hollowed cities. Mithridates would lose ground, then reclaim it. He would vanish into mountains, only to return with wolves at his side. He was a master of disappearance, of illusion, of turning defeat into deferral. But each retreat came at a cost. His allies began to fracture. His commanders argued in private chambers. His children, so many children, grew hungry for power. The cracks in his empire weren't just military, they were personal. And Mithridates, always the alchemist, could not transmute distrust into loyalty. Still, he endured. After Sulla's death, Mithridates seized his moment again, rising like smoke through the ruins. He invaded Bithynia, slaughtered another legion, pulled Rome back into the fire, but this time, Rome sent Pompey, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus Young, untested, but a tactician without mercy. Unlike Sulla, Pompey knew how to starve a man before drawing his sword. He closed the seas, cut the trade, turned allies into informants. Where Sulla tried to beat Mithridates with armies, Pompey tried to erase him with isolation. And slowly, it worked. The king began to fade. His supply lines frayed. His fleet was shattered off the coast of Cilicia. Cities turned their gates inward. His spies reported betrayals faster than he could punish them. And behind every failed campaign was the specter of something he could not fight. Time. He was aging. The poison still coursed through him, but they did not protect against loneliness, against the erosion of trust. His body endured, but the world had shifted beneath his feet. Even his son, Machaerus, turned Roman. You can imagine it, can't you? A man who had taught himself to fear nothing, watching his bloodline rot from within. A father who had raised his kingdom on suspicion, only to find it mirrored in the eyes of his heirs. And then, the final betrayal. Pharnaces, his favorite son, the one who had ridden beside him in victory, who had studied the herbs, the blades, the art of empire, the one he believed understood him. Pharnaces took the throne, declared Mithridates unfit, ordered his death. The student had become executioner. And the old king? He fled again, north into the snows of Colchis, into the mountains where no armies marched and no gods watched. And there, surrounded by a dwindling handful of loyalists, he tried to build one last army, one final defiance. But even the stars had stopped listening. His letters went unanswered. His gold lost its luster. His words, once sharp as glass, now rang hollow in the ears of hardened men. He had outlived his myth, and he knew it. So he reached, one last time, for the chalice, a blend of every poison he had ever tamed. He drank, and waited, and death refused him. The very immunity he had spent a lifetime building now laughed in his face. Even poison had abandoned him. Imagine the silence in that room, the way his breath must have caught, not in fear, but in irony. In the end, he had to beg for the blade. It was a Gallic mercenary who did it. Not a son, not a general, not a friend, a stranger with no name. One clean thrust, one final betrayal, and so Mithridates died, not as a king, nor as a god, but as a man who had trusted no one, and proved himself right. But tell me, what survives longer? The man or the fear he leaves behind? The dust has settled. The banners have rotted. Rome claimed his lands, his riches, his children. But his legend that still poisons the air. We're not finished, not yet. The story is darker than you think. There are things we've yet to uncover, wars fought in the minds of men, truths buried beneath centuries of lies. You're still with me? Then let's keep going. There is something strange about silence, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy waiting silence that follows catastrophe. The kind that sits thick in the lungs, that makes you turn your head, wondering if something's watching you from the dark. That's the silence that settled over the Black Sea after Mithridates died, or rather, after he was killed. Because death did not come to him gently. It had to be brought, like a sacrifice. A man who had outwitted poison, outlasted empires, and outmaneuvered generals had finally met a fate he couldn't train for: obsolescence. But what happens to a world built around a man when that man disappears? It doesn't collapse. Not at first. It mutates. After Mithridates' death, The power he'd held didn't simply vanish, it curdled, like blood left too long in the sun. And the first to drink from that poisoned cup was his son, Pharnaces II, the traitor son, the usurper. The boy who'd knelt to Rome with a dagger still warm in his father's heart. He took the throne of Pontus not with cheers, but with whispers. Because even dead, Mithridates cast a longer shadow than most kings do alive. And Pharnaces, for all his ambition, could not escape that shade. He tried, he aligned with Caesar, sent envoys to the Senate, promised peace and tribute and loyalty. He painted over the blood with diplomacy. But the East does not forget so easily. And Rome remembers everything. To them, Pharnaces was not a partner. He was leverage, a puppet with a familiar face. And so they kept him, like a dog on a leash, using him to maintain order in the poisoned lands his father had ruled with iron and suspicion. But Pharnaces was his father's son. At least in ambition, and ambition is a patient animal. For years he played along, bowed, smiled, sent gifts and tributes. But behind the curtain he watched, waited, because he knew what all broken bloodlines know. Power slips when the hand holding it grows distracted. And Rome in 49 BCE was very distracted. Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon. Civil war had begun, and the empire was suddenly looking inward, too consumed with its own unraveling to keep a firm grip on distant provinces. It was the crack Pharnaces had waited for. He struck, quickly, brutally, reclaimed Pontus, invaded Armenia, pushed into Cappadocia. He thought he could resurrect the Eastern Empire his father had once carved from Roman bone. He wanted not just the land, but the legend. But legends aren't inherited, they're earned. And Pharnaces, he wasn't Mithridates, because unlike his father, Pharnaces didn't prepare for the backlash. He didn't anticipate the speed with which Caesar, blood still drying on his sword from the Battle of Pharsalus, would respond. Within months, Caesar turned east. He marched with terrifying speed, bypassed defenses, ignored terrain. And when he finally met Pharnaces on the battlefield, at a small hill town called Zela, it ended before it began. 5 days. One decisive engagement. Caesar crushed him utterly. The battle was so swift, so absolute, that Caesar would send back just 3 words to the Senate in Rome, words that would echo through time like a taunt. Veni, vidi, vici, I came, I saw, I conquered, and with that, the sun was erased. Pharnaces fled, wounded, hunted, eventually cut down by one of his own former governors. No funeral, no last words, no kingdom, just a body in the dirt and a name already forgotten. But Mithridates, he endured. Even in death he was still spoken of, feared, remembered. His name passed like a ghost through Roman camps and enemy courts. Whispers that he had faked his death, that his blood made men immortal, that the formula for his anti-poison, Mithridatum, could cure any ailment, even fate. And here's where the story twists. Because while Rome laughed at his fall, it also began to imitate him. In the palaces of emperors, small glass vials appeared, filled with strange powders, dried roots, drops of mercury, fragments of viper flesh, crushed opium, saffron, honey, Mithridatum, named for the dead king. An antidote to all things, a cure for poison, a ward against death. Caesar took it, so did Augustus. Even Nero, drunk on madness, demanded it in his chambers. It became legend dressed as medicine, alchemy by way of fear. The irony, the man Rome hated most, became its apothecary. But there's something else, something darker, because the more you look at the Roman fascination with Mithridatum, the more you begin to see what Mithridates actually left behind. Not just a recipe, but a philosophy, a belief that one could master death by consumption, that immunity could be earned through endurance, that suffering when weaponized made gods of men. This idea, it outlived the Republic. It seeped into Byzantine texts, into medieval medicine, into Renaissance alchemy. It was copied, revised, guarded like scripture. For centuries, physicians swore by it, and even today, in laboratories and clinics, the shadow of that king remains. He wanted to conquer death. He didn't. But he infected time instead. And now I ask you, is that not a form of immortality? So as the world forgot his name, it remembered his methods, his madness, his myth. But don't be fooled, this story isn't over. There are things even darker buried beneath the foundations of Mithridates' obsession. Things that don't just belong to him, but to every ruler who tried to cheat death after him. We haven't reached the bottom yet. Shall we keep descending? The deeper we go, the colder it gets. Beneath the wars, beneath the betrayals and the empire's shifting sands, lies something more. Intimate. The part of Mithridates' life the historians glance past. The part that doesn't roar. It whispers. Softly, like a secret, buried beneath layers of power, blood, and ash. We begin again, not on the battlefield, but behind locked doors, in silence. With a boy. The palace in Sinop, his birthplace, stood like a stone sentinel over the Black Sea, windswept, brutal, and haunted even then. His father, Mithridates IV, ruled with cruelty, sharpened by fear. Poison was already in the air, already in the wine. And when Mithridates V, the future king, was just a child, he watched as his father died. Slowly, convulsing, eyes rolling, fingers curled like claws, assassinated, almost certainly. And from that moment the boy knew death comes from within, not from the front lines, not from swords or spears, but from cups, from trust. He became obsessed. They say he vanished into the forests for years after his father's death. Some say he was hiding from his own mother, who may have had a hand in the assassination. Others believe he was being hunted by his own court, by rivals, by shadows with too many names. But whatever the reason, when he returned he was no longer a boy. He was a survivor, and something in him had changed. He had lived wild, alone, tasting roots and insects, watching birds for signs of safe berries, studying animal deaths like a priest studies prophecy. The forest taught him the first truths about poison, and he began to consume it. On purpose. Not enough to kill, not at first, just enough to hurt, to burn the throat, to rupture the gut, to blur the line between life and death, until that line no longer frightened him. This was not madness. Not yet. This was strategy. Every drop of hemlock, every fleck of arsenic was a blade turned outward, not inward. He was armoring his body in secrecy, but here's where it gets darker. Because it worked, he came back stronger, fitter, immune to substances that would leave grown men twitching in agony. He ate from any plate, drank from any goblet, and watched, always watched. One official dropped dead after dinner, face blue, eyes wide. Another choked on blood in the middle of court. Mithridates simply sipped his wine, unbothered, unreachable. He began to test others, not just food tasters, not just enemies, family, servants, concubines. He needed to know how poisons worked on different kinds of bodies, how long they took, which organs failed first, which antidotes reversed what symptoms. He was compiling in silence what would become the most feared medical arsenal of the ancient world. But this is where the myth and the man blur, because some say he didn't just test antidotes on criminals. Some say he created criminals, fabricated accusations so he could legally execute them by poison, and watch closely. Not for justice, for data. His court began to reflect his paranoia. Every hallway was watched. Every conversation echoed through spies. Trust was not a currency. It was a liability. Those closest to him lived in a state of gentle terror. And yet, they stayed. Why? Because fear, when sculpted correctly, becomes awe. He spoke multiple languages, at least 22. Could recite Homer from memory. Knew geography, astronomy, philosophy. He was not just a monarch. He was a machine. And machines don't die easily. But even machines have faults. His obsession with survival became an obsession with control, not just of his enemies but of fate itself. He believed he could outthink death, outlast betrayal, outdesign his own downfall. And that belief was contagious. Mithridates began collecting more than poisons. He collected children. Some were his, born of concubines and alliances. Others were taken, stolen from noble families, adopted into his court under the pretense of diplomacy. He raised them together, trained them like soldiers, taught them to love him and only him. They were his army, his heirs, his experiment, and eventually his undoing. Because when you raise children in the crucible of fear, when you teach them that power is trust inverted, they become mirrors, and you may not like what stares back. One by one his children turned, not all at once, but slowly, subtly, a bribe here, a whispered promise there. Rome knew his weakness wasn't poison. It was love, or the closest thing he could feel to it. When Pharnaces finally took the throne, it wasn't with brute force. It was with the soft blade of familiarity, the same way Mithridates had once slipped poison into wine. Pharnaces slipped rebellion into the bloodstream of the court, and the king never saw it coming. That's the tragedy of a paranoid man. He sees enemies everywhere, except the ones that smile like he does. And now we return to that cold room, that final moment, that failed suicide. Mithridates kneeling on stone, coughing from the mixture of poisons he had brewed himself, knowing, perhaps for the first time, the weight of a life spent alone in a fortress of his own making, a life that even death refused. But it didn't end there, because after his death, his formulas survived, smuggled out of the court, copied, shared, bought and sold like relics. Over time, the ingredients changed, but the core idea remained. Pain is protection, suffering is strength, control is salvation. Even in modern medicine we see echoes, small doses of toxins used in vaccines, in treatments, in research. The line between cure and curse, thinner than you think. And so I ask you, was Mithridates a madman, or was he simply early? The ancient world buried his bones, but it kept his methods. And now, we're getting closer to the center, closer to the heart of something Rome never understood, and maybe never wanted to. You still want to go deeper? Then follow me. The next door has no key. Just a question. What does a legacy taste like? Not the marble statues, not the etched names in dusty scrolls. I mean the real legacy, the one that slips between the teeth. Metallic, bitter. A legacy distilled, drop by drop, into vials sealed with wax and superstition. The kind handed down not by scholars, but by whispering physicians and trembling apprentices. Let's go back to Rome. Not the Senate floor, not the triumphal arches or the blood-slicked sands of the Colosseum. Let's go beneath all that, into a small, cold room lit only by the flickering glow of an oil lamp. A physician leans over a worn scroll, tracing a formula penned in a dead king's hand. Mithridatum. It's not just a word anymore. It's a weapon, a talisman, a myth, and it's spreading. Because after Mithridates fell, his enemies didn't destroy his work. They adopted it. Julius Caesar is said to have taken it regularly. So did Augustus. So did Tiberius. Because if you rule a world where betrayal is served at every banquet, then survival becomes an art. And no one painted it darker than Mithridates. But something happened in the centuries that followed, something even he couldn't predict. Rome began to ritualize his medicine. The original Mithridatum recipe, they said, had 65 ingredients. 65. Viper flesh, opium, frankincense, saffron, cinnamon, myrrh, bitumen, turpentine, honey, poppy, castoreum scraped from beaver glands, a dozen kinds of roots and resins, everyone chosen not just for its medicinal properties, but for its symbolism, for its connection to death, rebirth, and resistance. It became less about curing and more about protecting, not from disease, but from fate. Imagine the ritual. An emperor standing half-naked in a chamber of marble and steam, his personal physician grinding dried viper meat with wine and rose oil. A prayer muttered in Greek, a sip of the mixture, a pause, a shiver, then silence. If you listened closely, you might hear the echo of a voice long dead, a voice that once belonged to a king who never trusted a single soul. It wasn't just a cure anymore, it was a sacrament, But here's the twist. Over time, the formula grew. More ingredients, more ceremony. By the 2nd century CE, a new version emerged, Theriac of Andromachus, an evolution of Mithridatum. It contained up to 80 components. Think about that. A concoction so complex it took days to make, weeks to age, and only minutes to consume. And people believed in it. Not just emperors, but the poor, the desperate, the sick. Street vendors would chant its praises. Apothecaries sold diluted versions in glass bottles shaped like skulls or serpents. It was the penicillin of the ancient world. If penicillin had a cult following and was born in a forest under the watch of a paranoid king. But belief is a dangerous thing, especially when it replaces truth. Because by the time Mithridatum had passed into the Middle Ages, its original purpose was gone, forgotten. It became legend, a name people said without knowing who Mithridates even was. He had become an idea, a ghost in the bloodstream. Kings across Europe demanded their own versions. Charlemagne ordered it, so did the Medicis. Venice became a hub for manufacturing it. Pills stamped with seals, watched over by official guilds. There were even laws about who could prepare it and how. Imagine that, a dead king from Pontus reaching through 1,000 years of history, and still controlling what people could put into their mouths. But here's where the darkness deepens. Because not everyone trusted the legend, some began to ask questions. Why did the recipe change so often? Why were so many of the ingredients impossible to verify? Why did so many apothecaries die mysteriously shortly after altering a batch? There were rumors that some versions of Mithridatum were poison in disguise, that rivals used the myth to eliminate enemies, hiding death behind the veil of immunity, that certain rulers would consume it religiously for years, only to waste away from within, their bodies pickled in a confusion of toxins. Maybe Mithridates hadn't defeated poison after all. Maybe he just taught it to hide better. And isn't that the cruelest trick of all? To be killed by the very thing you thought would save you. Somewhere along the line blurred. Between medicine and magic, between truth and performance, between protection and obsession. Because even today, echoes of Mithridatum remain. In the concept of building tolerance, in microdosing, in vaccine theory, in our cultural reverence for those who suffer and survive. We still believe that strength comes from enduring pain, that immunity is earned through hardship, that if you swallow enough darkness, you can become untouchable. But what if you're wrong? What if the very act of trying to escape death is what invites it? Mithridates didn't leave behind an empire. He left behind a question, a whisper in the bloodstream of history. What are you willing to endure to survive, and when does survival become surrender? We followed his trail through palaces, across battlefields, into poison-stained scrolls and forgotten rituals. But the path doesn't end here. There's one more place we haven't gone, inside the mind. The part of Mithridates' legacy no one could bottle, not in wine, not in powder, not even in blood. Because if you want to understand what truly made him immortal, you have to enter the labyrinth he built inside himself. Are you ready? The door is still open, but once we cross it, there's no coming back. Step lightly. From here on, the ground shifts beneath our feet. We've traced the lines of Mithridates' empire, the poisons, the wars, the rituals. But the next chapter isn't written in ink or blood. It's carved into the soft clay of the human mind. To truly understand Mithridates, you must step into the silence between breaths, into the isolation that no crown could ease, into the obsession that no victory could quiet, because what he feared most wasn't death. It was powerlessness, and no fortress, no army, no vial of serpent blood tonic could protect him from that. Picture it, a stone chamber high in the cliffs above the Black Sea, wind howling outside like the voice of forgotten gods. Inside, the king sits alone, shoulders heavy with years of rule. In front of him, a scroll, unfurled, scrawled in his own hand, a formula, numbered a confession, fragments of thought looped like vines. Obsessive, repetitive, desperate. They will come. They always come. Trust no one. He would rewrite certain lines dozens of times, as if repetition could make them true, or maybe untrue. Maybe he was trying to erase the parts of himself he feared had already rotted. Because you see, Mithridates didn't just believe in poison, he became it. He let it shape him, twist him, define every glance, every alliance, every meal, every kiss. His intimacy with toxins was so complete, it blurred the line between man and substance. He didn't just survive poison, he let it inhabit him. But paranoia is a slow-moving plague. It doesn't scream, it whispers. And for Mithridates, those whispers got louder as his power grew. He built tunnels beneath his palaces, labyrinths without maps, hidden chambers with rotating doors, emergency exits that led nowhere but back to more stone, more shadow. Servants were rotated constantly, never allowed to learn his routines. He slept in different beds each night, ate from randomly selected bowls, drank only after his food tasters had waited, sometimes hours, to ensure they lived. He trusted no face, not his wife, not his children, not even the stars. And that's the tragedy, because a man who cannot trust, cannot love. Not truly. And yet history records that Mithridates had lovers, had passions, had moments of pleasure. But did he feel them? Or did he watch them, always, through a veil of calculation? In one forgotten text, barely surviving through fragments in the margins, a visitor to his court wrote this: "The king's smile is as rare as a comet. When it comes, we do not rejoice. We wonder who has died to cause it." And that says more than volumes. It says he had become so entangled in his own myth that he forgot how to be. To eat without suspicion, to sleep without weapons, to feel without flinching. He turned his heart into a fortress and found himself trapped inside. Still, the world kept spinning. Rome grew bolder, his allies grew distant, his children sharpened their knives, and Mithridates retreated. Not in war, not yet, but in spirit. He began to vanish from public ceremonies. His face, once a symbol of resilience, became a rare sight. Rumors spread. Was he ill, deformed, cursed? Some said he had begun experimenting on himself again. New toxins, new thresholds. That he was no longer chasing immunity, but transcendence. He believed, they said, that enough exposure to pain could awaken a new state of being. A man beyond suffering. A god. In the deepest levels of his palace there were rooms known only to a few. Rooms where he would sit alone for days, inhaling fumes, sipping tinctures made from unknown roots. He would hallucinate, speak in tongues, laugh when no one else dared to. These were not the acts of a madman. These were the acts of a man chasing meaning through the only language he had left: suffering. Because when you spend a lifetime shielding yourself from pain, you eventually forget what life feels like, and here lies the paradox. He wanted to live forever, but he had forgotten how to live. And so he slipped further into himself. One ally lost, one son defected. The borders of Pontus began to fray. Rome's grip tightened. Their blades were no longer whispers, they were thunder. But Mithridates didn't raise armies, not right away, because the war that mattered now wasn't with Rome, it was with the mirror. And in that mirror, he didn't see a king, he saw a child, watching his father die at a feast, feeling the first poison seep into his world. A child who decided, then and there, that safety was a myth and love was a dagger. That child grew up to conquer kingdoms, but never escaped the table, the goblet, the moment everything changed. So he wrote, he recorded, he refined, not his memoirs, but his proof, that he had done it, that he had survived what no one else could. That pain had made him strong, even if it had also made him alone. And now? Now the Roman legions are marching. His allies have fled. His blood has turned against him, and somewhere in the dark, the last experiment begins. But not yet. There's still one chamber left to enter, one secret he never shared, one door he never opened, not to Rome, not to lovers, not even to himself. And that's where we go next. Not into history, but into memory. the oldest poison of all. It begins with a knock, not on wood, not on stone, but on the inside of the skull. Soft, steady, unmistakable. Memory doesn't announce itself politely. It arrives like a splinter beneath the skin, like a whisper too loud to ignore. And for Mithridates, that knock never stopped. It echoed even as Rome bore down on him, even as his armies faltered, even as his own blood conspired, because memory has no mercy. It doesn't care how many cities you've taken, how many names you've buried, how many poisons you've swallowed and survived. It slips past the walls, through the armor, into the marrow, and when it gets there, it burns. The memory that haunted Mithridates most wasn't of war. It was of family, more specifically, his mother, Mithridates VI, queen, regnant, reagent, and perhaps the first assassin he ever knew. She ruled in his place after the death of his father, but her regency was no mere caretaking. It was a throne of ice and knives. She favored his younger brother. Rumors whispered that she poisoned food meant for Mithridates, that she tried to eliminate him not out of malice, but out of fear, because even as a child, there was something unnatural in his eyes. He disappeared for long stretches, slept in caves, trained in secret, studied plants, animals, poisons. He taught himself languages no one in court spoke: Greek, Persian, Scythian, Latin, Galatian. He returned speaking in riddles and threats. He was no longer a prince. He was a myth forming in real time, and when he took the throne, really took it, Mithridates vanished. Some say he spared her, some say he didn't. The records are blank, scrubbed clean like a wound left open too long, but the memory remained. That your first betrayal came from the person who gave you breath. How do you trust anyone after that? How do you sit beside your children without tasting ashes? How do you feel love without wondering how sharp its edge is? You don't. You turn inward. And that's exactly what Mithridates did. As Rome approached, he didn't retreat in shame. He retreated with intent. He moved north to the Crimea, his last redoubt. He began building fortresses, not just of stone, but of disciples. Young men who followed him not because of his bloodline, but because of his legend. He called them his poison sons. They took his teachings, his methods. They trained in the same rituals, drank the same poisons. Some survived, some didn't. It didn't matter. To Mithridates, this was the final crucible. Not for war, not for glory, but for transmission. He wasn't trying to escape death. He was trying to outlive it. Through them, through formulae memorized and hidden in tattoos and coded songs, through scrolls buried in sealed jars, under cryptic stone markers only he could decipher. He wanted to create an immortal thread, an unbroken chain of knowledge that could never be extinguished, even if his flesh turned to dust. But the truth? He was running out of time. Rome had learned, adapted. Their generals no longer underestimated him. His allies were gone. His sons were either in revolt or in chains. The empire was closing in like a storm of steel. And in the midst of this collapse, he made a decision. He would die, but not like anyone else. Not begging, not in shame, not from a Roman sword or under Roman judgment. He would choose his own exit, so he turned again to the only gods he trusted, the poisons. He prepared a final concoction, a dose meant to end him, not in agony, but in reclamation. He believed he had mastered it, that his body, after decades of microdosing, was impervious to any natural dose. But this would be different. A final note in the symphony he'd been composing since childhood. The vial was ready. His last confidant stood silent. He lifted it, drank, and waited. Nothing, not even a tremor. The very thing that had defined him, had betrayed him. His immunity had become his prison. The poisons refused to kill their master, and so the legend fractures. Some say he begged a loyal soldier to stab him through the heart. Some say he poisoned a dagger and plunged it into his own chest, cursing his body for its treacherous strength. Others say he simply sat and laughed, a sound full of rage, irony, and surrender, because in the end, even death had to work harder to claim him. But he did die, somewhere in the Crimea, somewhere between poison and steel, somewhere between fact and myth, and Rome. They found only fragments, scattered forces, hidden texts, murmurs of resistance. They thought the story was over. But stories like his don't end. They ripple through time, through medicine, through fear, through the quiet terror of every ruler who sits at a table and wonders, what's in the wine? Because Mithridates didn't just teach us about poison, he taught us about paranoia. About the cost of control, about what happens when the pursuit of survival becomes the very thing that consumes you. And even now, centuries later, he lingers, in rituals, in formulas, in whispered advice to chew your food slowly, watch the cup, trust no one. He is still with us, still watching, still waiting. But the final truth? It's not in the poison. It's in the mirror. And what you see, when you look too long into the eyes of a man who never let himself be human, the wind never stops in the Crimea. It whips across the steppes like a memory looking for somewhere to land. A soundless scream echoing through time, clawing at the stones that once formed the last walls of Mithridates' life. And if you stand there alone, just before dusk, you can almost feel him. Not the king, not the warrior, but the ghost. Because that's all that remains now. A presence caught between legend and silence. But the ghost didn't die with the man. It traveled, it infected, and it took root where he could never reach. In Rome. Imagine the irony. The very empire that hunted him came to revere him. They took his antidote. They took his warnings. They studied his texts, rebranded his fears, institutionalized his madness. Even centuries later, Roman physicians spoke his name as if it held talismanic power, Mithridates. The syllables became a shield, a spell, a symbol of resistance against the unseen killer in every cup. And as Roman power spread, so did the myth. Through monasteries, through royal courts, through the hands of alchemists and herbalists, through ink on fragile parchment carried on the backs of traders and thieves. The antidote evolved again. More ingredients, more rituals, more mysticism. It was no longer a medicine. It was a philosophy. A belief that immunity could be earned, that the world was poison, and the only way to survive it was to consume it. Does that sound familiar? It should, because we've never left that idea behind. It shows up in every bitter tonic we drink, every self-inflicted challenge we undertake, every whispered superstition about toughening up to avoid weakness. We wear trauma like armor. We call pain a teacher. We pretend that by facing death often enough, we can stop fearing it. But here's the truth no one likes to say. Mithridates didn't conquer fear. He was devoured by it. Every precaution, every secret tunnel, every poisoned sip. It was all fear, dressed in robes and ritual, and it never left him. Because paranoia doesn't end, it only sleeps, waiting for a new host. And history, it gave it many. In medieval Venice, guilds were sworn to secrecy to reproduce his formula. If they failed, they vanished. Some were burned, others simply disappeared. There were whispers that the city's leaders feared the recipe could be used against them, that someone would perfect it not as a cure, but as a curse. In Renaissance France, Catherine de' Medici kept her own version, tasted by servants, refined by court alchemists. She wore perfume laced with antidotes. She lined her gloves with protective oils. She believed poison was not just a threat, but a language, one that only the powerful could afford to speak fluently. In London, during the Great Plague, apothecaries sold knockoff Mithridatum by the vial. Market stalls overflowed with versions that smelled of decay and spice. Mothers fed it to children with trembling hands, not knowing if they were granting life or sealing death. But the most chilling part, it didn't work. Not really. By then it was mostly theater, a performance of protection, a way to believe even falsely that you were doing something. And that is the most human thing of all, to need the illusion of control even as the world burns. Because that's what Mithridates gave us, not just a cure but a mirror, one that shows us who we become when we fear the world too much to live in it fully. And perhaps that's why his story keeps returning. In every outbreak, every betrayal, every moment we hesitate before a drink we didn't pour ourselves, we see him, not as a monster, not even as a hero, but as a warning of how far you can go in the name of survival, of how easily resistance becomes ritual, and how quickly ritual becomes madness. But there's something else in the ghost's eyes, something quieter, sadder. He wanted to be remembered, not as a tyrant, not as a corpse, but as a man who refused to die. And in a way, he got his wish. His body may have rotted in some forgotten stone tomb, swallowed by dust and time, but his fear? That still breathes. You can hear it in the rustle of apothecary jars, in the creak of palace doors, in the bitter sting of something unknown at the back of your throat. The legacy of Mithridates isn't his formula. It's the feeling that follows it. That sense, subtle, primal, unshakable, that something is always after you. And that maybe, just maybe, you're not ready for it. But what if you could be? What if you could prepare? What if, like him, you could win? That's the seduction. That's the trap. And that's the door we open next. The one not into history, but into us. Darkness doesn't fall all at once. It seeps. Slowly, subtly, the way poison does. One drop at a time. And by the time you notice it, it's everywhere. In your thoughts, in your breath, in the quiet things you tell yourself to feel safe. This is where the shadow of Mithridates truly lives. Not in tombs or scrolls, but in modern minds. You see, the story didn't end in the ancient world. It just evolved, became more palatable, more clinical. We gave it new names: toxicology, immunotherapy, psychological resilience. But at its core, it's the same question. How much of the world's poison can you take before it destroys you? And now, more than 2,000 years after a lonely king drank his final vial in a frozen palace above the Black Sea, we're still asking it. Except now, the poisons look different. Not hemlock or belladonna, but radiation, chemical exposure, digital overstimulation, trauma you can't see on an autopsy, grief that metastasizes into silence, and we respond the same way he did. We dose ourselves, with noise, with numbing, with rituals of control, modern wellness culture, clean eating, detox drinks, immunity boosters. It's built on the bones of Mithridates' myth. We frame it as healing, but underneath, it's fear. The same ancient dread that the world is trying to seep into us, that the air, the food, the people we love, any of it could kill us, quietly. So we fight back, with science, with supplements, with steel and screens and surveillance, and still, we don't feel safe. Because the enemy was never just the poison, it was doubt. The same doubt that gnawed at Mithridates when he lay awake in rotating beds, his sword always within reach, his lovers watched like spies. The same doubt that made him feed his children in sequence, never all at once. That made him vanish from his court for weeks to conduct research on himself, testing pain as if it were a science. We do the same now, just more discreetly. We Google symptoms until we're sick with certainty. We micromanage our environments, remove every allergen, cancel every risk. We give our children helmets, curfews, camera-monitored cribs, but no fortress is ever enough. That's what he learned, and that's what we're still learning. Because what Mithridates chased wasn't immunity, it was invulnerability. And that's a myth more poisonous than any draft he ever drank. To live without vulnerability is to live without connection, without spontaneity, without love, and that, in the end, was his curse. He didn't die from poison. He died from isolation. Even surrounded by followers, lovers, armies, he was alone. A fortress turned inward, a kingdom of one, and that legacy, that is the one most alive today. We don't build empires anymore. We build silos, echo chambers, walls made of ideology and fear. We medicate our moods, sanitize our emotions, hide anything that might look like weakness. Because weakness, we've been told, is how the poison gets in. But what if we've misunderstood? What if immunity isn't built through resistance, but through exposure? Through letting life in, fully, messily, painfully? What if Mithridates had let someone close? Truly close? Would the poison have found him anyway? Maybe. But maybe it wouldn't have mattered. Maybe it's not about whether the blade strikes. Maybe it's about whether you lived before it did. And maybe that's the part of his story that gets drowned out in the shadow and spectacle. The truth we bury beneath the awe and the horror, that his greatest tragedy wasn't that he couldn't die. It was that he never really lived, not without armor, not without fear, not as a man, only ever as a myth. And that is the poison that lingers longest, not the ones we fear, but the ones we become. In the final chapter, we will return to the beginning, to the dinner table, to the first dose, to the boy who watched a father die and decided he would never be powerless again, not knowing that in trying to master death he had surrendered his life. It begins with a meal, not a battle, not a decree, just a table laid with care, bread, olives, slices of lamb dressed in honey and vinegar, wine poured, candles flickering against polished bronze, a king, not yet a king, seated beside his father, a boy of perhaps 11, Mithridates VI. He watches the old man drink, listens to the laughter, smells the spice in the air, hears the words, soft in Greek, about legacy, strength, trust. Words a boy isn't meant to fully understand, but he understands something else. The sudden silence, the stillness, the slump of a body. The wide eyes frozen open, the stain spreading across white linen. He understands death, and he understands one thing more, that it can arrive quietly, through the most intimate rituals, through love, through comfort, through food, that it hides, beautifully, in the things we trust. From that moment on, Mithridates is no longer a child. He becomes something else. He learns to read the language of poison like others learn prayer. He begins with small doses, hemlock under the tongue, belladonna brewed in wine, arsenic powdered into pomegranate seeds. Pain becomes his liturgy, resistance his scripture. He doesn't grow up. He armors, layer by invisible layer. He wraps himself in immunity, not just to death, but to love, to touch, to belief. And yet, through it all, something ancient follows him. The boy at the table, the one who saw trust murdered, the one who never ate again without fear. We think of Mithridates as a king, a scientist, a madman, but perhaps he was always just that child, caught in a moment, endlessly trying to prevent it from happening again. How human is that? How tragic. We build our lives around control. We confuse vigilance with virtue, but control is an illusion. The harder we clutch it, the faster it slips through us, like wine on linen, like breath from the lungs. And poison? Poison adapts. It doesn't just live in flasks or flowers, it lives in memory, in pride, in isolation, in the lie that we can protect ourselves from pain by building walls tall enough, rituals strict enough, plans detailed enough. But pain, like love, finds a way in. Always. Mithridates thought he was fighting death. He was really fighting life, because life is the vulnerability we spend our whole existence trying to manage. And in trying to make himself unkillable, he forgot how to live. He left behind no heirs of blood, only heirs of belief. Kings, queens, emperors, scientists, survivalists, each chasing his impossible dream, to be untouchable, to be immune. But immunity without intimacy is a prison. And what good is surviving the world if it means you never really felt it? So here we are, centuries later, still afraid of the cup in our hands, still watching the shadows at dinner, still whispering his name when we talk of resilience. Mithridates, the king who swallowed death so often he became allergic to life. He thought the answer was dosage. He thought the answer was discipline. He thought the answer was control. But maybe The answer was forgiveness. Forgiveness for a world that doesn't make sense. Forgiveness for a body that bleeds. Forgiveness for the mother who failed him. For the father who died. For the child who never got to be one. Maybe that's the true antidote. Not in powders. Not in potions, but in surrender. In laying down the knife. In eating the meal. In trusting again, even knowing the risk. Because to live fully is to accept that risk. That is the real cure, and that is the one thing Mithridates never found. The boy, the king, the myth. He spent a life preparing to die, but not a moment learning how to live. And that, perhaps, is the bitterest poison of all.